رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي ربي زدني علما. In the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and send peace and blessings upon our final messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Welcome everyone to our first Tuesday night class for the semester, unpacking our stories, Surah Yusuf. Um, I see all of you who are on, alhamdulillah, you don't need an introduction because you've joined us before, but those who are also watching on Facebook Live, this semester we're doing things slightly differently, in which we'll be exploring Surah Yusuf, and specifically focusing on the longest single narrative within the Qur'an. And as we're focusing on the single narrative within the Qur'an, uh, we're going to be really trying to understand what does the idea of a story really mean, and what can we take about our own individual stories that all of us are kind of constantly involved in. And my goal in this is to have a very active relationship with the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, of course, as was the goal last time when we were conversing with the Quran, but specifically with Surah Yusuf. It's so dense in terms of the amount of topics that are found within it that I do want to take it piece by piece and not try to rush through the story, because I think most of us have heard this full story before. And I'm not saying that there isn't any literary value in going through the full story, but I'm not going to focus as much on the full story as much as I'm going to focus on each individual piece as we explore. Those of you who I've made co-hosts, go ahead and start letting people in as they come in, because I oftentimes get distracted as
Yep,
time goes on.
gotcha.
And of course, at any point, if there's ever a reflection or you want to share something, that's the point of this gathering, for all of us to, inshallah, explore Surah Yusuf together. And how I really wanted to start this off was, first and foremost, the idea of, if we want to understand Surah Yusuf properly, um, recognizing that it's so unique in terms of where it occurs in the Quran and when it occurs in the lifetime of the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Surah Yusuf, does anyone remember when it was revealed to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam?
No, not really.
Surah Yusuf was revealed to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam in what's known as Am al-Huzn, or the year of sadness. It's the year that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam loses his wife Khadija, loses his uncle, and protection. So he loses both his internal sense of protection, which is his wife. He relied on her for support. There are so many beautiful narrations about the Prophet. Actually, in fact, even when he got the first revelation, he ran to her and she provided him emotional support. And he loses his external support, which is Abu Talib, his uncle, who was quite literally giving him protection. Because we remember this is back in tribal days in which your family was literally your citizenship, the one who would maintain your rights for you. So both his internal and his external world was destroyed by the loss of these two individuals. And it's in that year that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reveals Surah Yusuf. And what's unique about Surah Yusuf as well is it's a surah that was revealed in its entirety all at the same time. Up until this point, we had surahs that were either very short, or we had surahs that were revealed in piecemeal. But Surah Yusuf is revealed as one narrative completely from beginning to end, all at once. So this becomes unique for so many different reasons, but one of the major ones is it's given to the Prophet ﷺ right in the year that he needs it. It's the year of sadness, Am al-Huzn. And Surah Yusuf, even if we look at it from a linguistic perspective, Yusuf, yes, is a Hebrew name. That's why Joseph is of the same name that we talk about, like the biblical figure or the biblical prophet of Joseph. But Yusuf, if we take it from its Arabic root, it actually comes to Asafa. Asafa means sorrow. So there's also like this play on Arabic as well, that the story of Yusuf is someone who's been through deep sorrow and deep loss. And the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam is going through deep sadness and deep loss. But the focus that I wanted to get into is Allah reveals a story to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam when he's going through a difficult moment. I think it really does come down as one of the purposes of stories. One of the purposes of each and every one of us kind of hearing stories from others, it allows you to get through some of the most difficult tasks that you are going through. And what's proof of that? When Allah wanted to comfort our messenger, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, Allah revealed to him Surah Yusuf. So that is actually a very therapeutic way. And I'm not going to focus so much on the psychological aspect, but that's a very good therapeutic strategy as well, of both hearing other people's stories and encouraging you to share your own story is actually a way to process trauma, process grief, process sadness. is through that hearing stories, but also relaying your own story. So that's kind of where I wanted to start this off. Is that is, to me, that's one of the biggest elements of why we're doing this, is for each of us to process. Every one of us has certain things within each of our lives that are problematic, that we don't have the words to describe properly, that we're unsure who we can tell. And one of the things that when we read these struggling stories in the Qur'an is that it leads to a level of us processing our own experiences, because that's what it was for the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So throughout the course of the next 14 weeks, and I've actually divided Surah Yusuf into 14 parts. What I do want us to think about, I might even have little like assignments that no one's going to hold you to account for, but that I would encourage you to do. We're going to talk about things like sibling rivalries. We're going to talk about lost dreams. We're going to talk about lost opportunities. And I don't want us just to look at this as, oh, we're looking at a story that occurred in the past, but it's a story that's constantly happening to each and every one of us. Why would Allah want us to experience it, that it happening to someone else? Well, because it's a story that's constantly happening. Because while hearing and empathizing with the story of Yusuf alayhi salam, maybe it's going to make me get through my challenge a little bit better, have some language and how to pass through my test with some degree of nobility. So that's how I wanted to start off this whole series, inshallah, is for us to really appreciate that's one of the purposes behind it. And every story that's found within the Quran, that's really what it's supposed to do. That it's not just a story of the past, it's an eternal story that's happening, has happened dozens, hundreds of times, and will continue to happen in each of our lives personally, and also at a global level. And the way to also look at that in Surah Yusuf is, when we really look at the story of Yusuf alayhi salam, it's also paralleled with almost every other story in the Quran. But the main story that I want us to just think about as parallels is actually, as we're going through it, I'm going to parallel it a lot with the most mentioned prophet in the Quran. Anyone, who's the most mentioned prophet in the Quran?
Prophet Musa alayhi salam.
Yeah, Musa alayhi salam. There's actually a hadith of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam that said, if it wasn't for, and he mentions 2 or 3 surahs, Surah Al Imran, Surah Furqan, and 2 others, the Quran would have been just the Chronicles of Musa. The Quran would have just been a scattered book of stories of Musa alayhi salam. I think it's a beautiful thing to say, where the most mentioned story in the Quran is of Musa alayhi salam. And I love that they're contrasted together, because they couldn't be farther from actual, like, the structure. Musa alayhi salam's story is found in literally 36 places in the Quran, and in piecemeal all throughout. Yusuf alayhi salam's story is found in 1 place in the Quran, and just from start to finish. The reason I think that's interesting is people's lives aren't always the same. Like, literally, the way you hear about people's lives aren't the same. And the Quran captures that. What I mean by that is, think about some of your closest family members, right? I've never, with the closest people in your life, you hear their stories through what? Through, like, when I was a kid, this happened, and then you see them, like, so maybe a cousin or something, and you see them like a year later, and then they tell you something else, and then you experience something with them, and then maybe you read about them online or something. So you had these piecemeal factions of their story. Versus there are certain other people who you read an entire story all together. They sit down, they literally tell you their life story in like an hour or 2 hours. And I think both styles are captured within the Quran. And the two longest stories are of Musa alayhi salam and Yusuf alayhi salam, and they can't be farther from the style that they're put together with. But these 2 stories are also intricately linked. The first way is, if we look at it on a major level, Yusuf alayhi salam, his story historically takes place way before, probably 100 or so years before Musa alayhi salam, 100 years at least before Musa alayhi salam. And the story of Yusuf alayhi salam, what happens? It's Yusuf at the end of it brings his entire family over to Egypt. They go from Canaan, from Palestine, to Egypt. And Musa alayhi salam's story, they go from what? The Bani Israel, the same group of people again, go from Egypt to Palestine, to Canaan. Like, it happens the same exact way. This is how the Bani Israel came to Egypt with Yusuf alayhi salam's story. This is how they left Egypt in Yusuf alayhi salam's story. I mean, in Musa alayhi salam's story, and I think there's such beauty in that because there's this idea of like that rags to riches story that's found in Hollywood all the time. Like it's one of the 7 tropes of what a movie is. That's Yusuf alayhi salam's story. But then there's also another famous Hollywood story, and what is that? From riches to simplicity. Right? Someone goes from like being a prince or something to being a farmer, and that's literally what happens in the story of Musa. But there's dignity in both. There's dignity in what? Going from being a country boy like Yusuf alayhi salam to being eventually what? Literally a king. Towards the end of the story of Yusuf alayhi salam, he puts his parents on the throne of Egypt. And Musa alayhi salam, he's born and raised as a prince, but then what does he end up doing? He takes a group of people into the desert, into like farm life. But both of them were more dignified at the end of the day as a result. So we have this in terms of like on a massive level, how these two stories are compared. And then we can go even into the microcosms of this story and how much they contrast each other. The micro stories would be, when you look at Yusuf alayhi salam, his father is mentioned, his mother's never mentioned. His brothers are mentioned, no mentions of sisters or anything. You look at Musa alayhi salam, his mother is mentioned, his foster mother is mentioned, his spouse is mentioned, his sister is mentioned. With Yusuf alayhi salam, you seem to have all of these male figures all throughout his life. With Yusuf alayhi salam, you have all of these female figures. I mean, the other way around. Yusuf alayhi salam, you have all of these male figures all throughout his life. Musa alayhi salam, you have all of these female figures all throughout his life. Interesting how the contrast kind of works there. So there's contrasts that are found in terms of that. The mother, the sister is described very early on versus Musa alayhi salam. In Musa alayhi salam's story, in Yusuf alayhi salam's story, you have the father and the brothers. You have both of them having similar tropes within their stories. Well, there's moments of isolation that they go through. Yusuf alayhi salam, when he's young, he's thrown into a well. And from the well, much later on in his life, he's thrown into prison for a decade or so. Musa alayhi salam, you have something very similar. Musa alayhi salam, he starts his life off in isolation. What? His mother has to put him in a river. And then he runs away from Egypt and he ends up in a desert. 2 moments of isolation. But then even in their isolation, there's similarities, but there's also massive differences. And what are the massive differences? I like focusing on 2 massive differences within these stories. One is both of their parents make a dua in the story of Musa and the story of Yusuf. Anyone remember what dua the mother of Musa made? I've been talking for a while, so I'm going to start asking questions now. What naturally seems like the dua she would make as soon as she puts her child in the river? Very early on.
Like come to Allah for like patience and strength, something along those lines.
Yeah, for patience and strength. But if we really wanted to say, what's her biggest need in that moment? I want to be reunited with my child. The mother of Musa, she's putting like, Ya Allah, whatever way, just make me reunited with my child. Allah even captures that in order for her eyes to become cool, we reunited Musa with her son. We reunited the mother of Musa with her son. How long does it take for her dua to be accepted?
Very quickly, like as soon as he's hungry, he ends up back with his mother.
Yeah. Isn't that beautiful? Literally, the way it's understood is by the time he ate next, and I have a 6-month-old upstairs, and I can tell you that like from one feeding to the next feeding is like 2 hours. That's typically how long it takes. Like hours later, he's reunited with his child.
So
Go ahead, Zishan.
So something that's also like, yeah, they were reunited very quickly, but on the other hand, like they're reunited in the most like fantastic of ways. Like no one would have expected that Musa alayhi salam would have come to the household of the very person trying to kill him. Yeah. So I think that's like says something about like, like how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala answers du'as.
Definitely. Now I want to contrast that with, is there another, in the story of Yusuf alayhi salam, do you guys remember if there's a parent who asks for their child to come back to them?
Yeah, Yaqub alayhi salam.
When does he make that dua?
When his son disappears.
I would assume when Yusuf alayhi salam is like in the story, he's like maybe 7 or 8 years old. That's when it happens. When does his dua get answered?
By the time Yusuf alayhi salam was like a grown up and like the king of somewhere, so many, many years later.
Yeah. About by most accounts, it's about 3 decades later. That's I don't want to use the term crazy, but that's subhanAllah, that's such a and just as Zishan mentioned, the way that the dua was answered, how unpredictable it was for Musa alayhi salam's dua to be answered and Musa alayhi salam's mother's dua to be answered. Same thing with Yusuf alayhi salam. How he gets his son back, with the amount of dignity and amazingness that has taken place in between. But it also, there's that contrast of du'as can sometimes be answered like that. Other times, du'as are going to take what? Decades. But they're still good in both of them. And you find that over and over again with these contrasts that take place between the story of Musa and Yusuf, that they give us the two opposites. Musa alayhi salam himself makes a dua in the Qur'an, in which he says, Inni lima anzalta ilayya min khairin faqir. He's sitting, and this is you've all heard this before. He's sitting literally after he ran away from Egypt, he's sitting under shade. And he says, Ya Allah, any good, he does a good deed. He helps those 2 women out and says, Ya Allah, any good you're sending my way, I need it. And then literally the same exact way, not a meal goes by that he has a woman in front of him saying, my father wants to pay you. And that meal eventually, by providing you a meal, and that meal eventually leads to him getting married, finding a place of employment, and finding a place of residence. Within what? Hours, possibly, of him making that dua. Yusuf alayhi salam does a good deed in prison. He interprets the dreams of these 2 inmates that are there. And to one of them, he says, hey, mention my case to the king. I'm sitting here without a trial. I'm just sitting here in this prison. Mention my case. The dude takes another 10 years or so. And eventually, Yusuf alayhi salam's dua is answered, or his request is answered. Just kind of so interesting how contrasted that is. And the reason I also think it's so interesting how contrasted that is think about how we receive the story of Musa alayhi salam versus how we receive Yusuf alayhi salam's story. Yusuf alayhi salam's story, typically, if you've ever heard it in a speech, you hear about the entire story in one go. Why? Because that's how it was revealed. Yet it's so long from beginning to end. And for any major point happening within the story, sometimes there's years pass in between. Musa alayhi salam's story found all throughout the Qur'an, and you hear about it from literally your life from the beginning to the end, but things happen almost instantly in his life. I just find these contrasts to be just so amazing because it's literally the extent of how we experience life, and we experience things like the will of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in each of our lives, is it does vary so much, and Allah captures that within these stories, so that as they're happening to us, we're like, yeah, we're supposed to gain confidence. My story might be like the story of Musa alayhi salam. My du'as might be like the du'as of Musa alayhi salam, or they could be what? They could be like the du'as of Yusuf alayhi salam. Do we say one's better than the other? No. You're both amazing messengers of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And we have the ability of kind of living through each of those. SubhanAllah. I've been talking for a while. Before we start getting in, anyone have any other kind of reflections before we start jumping into the surah itself?
It reminds me of how, well, first of all, Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullah.
It reminds me of how with Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam, he said, Hasbiyallahu wa ni'mal wakeel, and then the fire became cool for him almost immediately. Whereas with, Ayyub alayhi salam, it took so long and he suffered for such a long time bearing patience. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, gifted him with that patience and, kind of mitigated the hurt, the sickness and everything. But it reminded me of that, the contrast between the 2 prophets and how one was immediately answered and the other wasn't immediately answered, but they're both amazing prophets at the end of the day.
Yeah. Definitely, subhanAllah.
Yeah, going off of that, I was thinking like how oftentimes like if we make a dua and like it doesn't come true, or like we ask for something and it doesn't happen, like our common reaction is to get upset. We think like, like Allah's not happy with us, we're not doing something right, or like, we're not like as good of a Muslim as we should be, that's why it's not coming true. But like I don't think I've ever seen anyone wait as long as like Yaqub alayhi salam. So it just shows that duas come true at their own time. It's not like always about us, it's about like Allah's timing. So I feel like I usually think like, oh, like Allah's not happy with me if like my dua is not coming true. But instead it's just that it's not the right time for the dua to come true.
Yeah. Like those are definitely there. Those are lessons for each of us to take away. And as we read about them, it makes us more sure about our own situation. Because these are literal examples from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala of stories that of all of humanity, these are stories that you need to know to have a proper approach to reality. And these will be the stories that we have to give us confidence to get us through our own moments when we feel like maybe our du'as aren't being answered. With that, inshallah, we're going to start off with the first couple of ayat of Surah Yusuf. And today we're only going to get through about 3 ayat of Surah Yusuf. And those who know this surah a little bit might complain. The story doesn't even start yet. Yeah, we'll get into why. It doesn't even start yet. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because there's one of the ayat that we're going to talk about is Allah is going to say, "Nahnu naqussu alayka ahsan al-qasas." We have related to you the best of following. I know it's typically translated as stories, but I'm going to say of following, of presentation. And one thing that almost anyone who has ever written a story or anyone who's good at storytelling or story writing needs to do is, how do you set up the audience to properly consume the story? It's almost as important how they receive it as it is the story itself. And Allah captures that. That's why in Surah Yusuf, there's a beginning part and an end part. There's like epilogues throughout. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala actually captures that with ayah number 1. It's not only the best story, but it's also the best way of getting us ready to be prepared to consume the best story. Alif Lam Ra. Anyone know what that means?
No, and no one ever will. No human, at least.
Great answer. That was more of a trick question, and you saw through it. But yeah, we have no idea. And the reason I think this is such a brilliant, of course, this is going to be my own conjecture, because there's humility in just having that. I have no idea. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala doesn't start off with what you know. Allah starts off with what you will never know. Because it's a way of forcing us recognize who's telling you the story. This is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala telling you the story. You know how I have a terrible time in doing this, but or that's why I'm a terrible person to watch a movie with. But oftentimes, like, I will analyze the author's intent as a certain scene is shown. And like there's like this arrogance with that's sometimes I'm accused of, is that I watch a movie with, because I'll try to analyze, like, why did the author do this? Why did the author do this? And like try to go from a director's point of view. And one of the reasons I love this is Allah starts off with the longest narrative in the Qur'an with Alif Lam Ra. And if you ask her, like, what does it mean? It actually just puts you in your place. You won't know the meaning. No, there are certain things you will know, but there's also certain things you will never know. And this will be something you never know. You will never fully understand. That doesn't mean you shouldn't try, but you have limits to your knowledge and limits to your understanding. I just think that's beautiful and brilliant, of like, you approach this story with humility. We don't get to criticize the story. We don't get to say, it would have been better. I do this all the time when I'm watching a movie. That scene should have come first. That should have done this. They should have done a little bit more character building before doing this. You don't get to do that. Alif Lam Ra. Because this is going to have stuff it's going to be way above your pay grade, way above your understanding ever. Tilka ayatul kitab al-mubin. These are the verses of a clear book, of the clear book. Was the Qur'an a book yet when these ayats were being revealed?
No, I don't think so.
From our understanding, there weren't even like entire surahs written down yet. Like this is Meccan Qur'an, like relatively early on in Mecca. There's no books. The Qur'an's not literally been written down as a mushaf yet. But Allah says these are verses of a clear book. And also these are verses. Tilka is from far away. In Arabic, when you say like hada would be like it's right here. But it's tilka, those verses. Those signs are from a clear book. There's many ways of really looking at that. And I'm part of what I encourage in these is for us, anytime something happens, not in an arrogant way, we're saying, why would Allah do this? But in a way of kind of espousing meaning, appreciating and thinking about every word that Allah put, every detail that Allah writes in this Qur'an has a level of guidance to it. That's our belief with literally every letter of the Qur'an has guidance for each and every one of us. So to ask, why would Allah put this there next and try to come up with a reason for it? And there's many ways of looking at it. One is, I personally see this as the Quran was always meant to be written down. It eventually was going to be written down. Why? Because it's called itself kitab so many times. Kitab literally is something that is inscribed or written, like it's a visual form of reading. It was meant to be that. There's other ways of looking at it in that way of tilka ayatul kitab al mubin is these are signs of a clear book in terms of like these are just what's about to be presented right now is a part of a much bigger narrative. Not just like Qur'an is the Qur'an right now, but of a much bigger narrative in general. Like these are just small parts of a much bigger thing that's eventually going to be fully inscribed. And inscribed kitab in what? Inscribed in, of course, the idea of like the Qur'an being a mushaf, but also kitab in terms of like inscribed in you. These are signs that are going to be inscribed in you. It's building up the story itself. Like when someone's about to give you like a amazing message, like this will hit home if you let it. This will really hit home. This will be like it's inscribed to you. If you pay attention now, this is a life lesson. Like, you know how we would use those words of emphasis? That's what this is. They're clear, and mubin is clear and clarifying, meaning that it's gonna be clear to see, and it's gonna make everything around you clear. If you just pay attention right now. Anyone, when you read these are the verses of a clear book, do you see anything differently?
I have a question. So I haven't done too much research on this concept, but when it says on Yawm al-Qiyamah, when we're gonna have a book of our bad deeds and our good deeds, like, is it really gonna be like a book, or is it gonna be more of like a record or a proof or something of that? That's kind of what this makes me think of.
Yeah. That the term kitab is typically used then too, or kutub, and in those cases it is meant to be like it's just something that records, something that it like has set itself in you know how we term set in stone is the term we use. That's the type of imagery that's being found there, and yeah, so that's very much the word that would be used. So I think it follows through the same way.
Chapin, quick question.
Mhm.
Will you screen share the surah?
Yes, I will go ahead and screen share the surah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I think that'll be easier to follow for everyone, right?
Yeah.
Window. Here we go.
So I also think about that, when the Quran was revealed to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, it was him being the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. It was immediately like inscribed in him. Yeah, that's what I think about.
Yeah, I can see that. These are verses of like kitab. For him, they're immediately inscribed. So yeah, I can see that being kind of put forward too. And it's also a clear book in terms of like it's clear and clarifying. The reason I always say that is the Quran does not cause, when you're like approaching the Quran properly, it doesn't cause you to be more confused. Like it causes clarity to appear. And those are the verses that cause that. I'm going to move on to the next ayah because I think it builds on. Of course, every ayah builds on the ayah that comes before, but it builds on very significantly. إِنَّا أَنزَلْنَاهُ قُرْآنًا عَرَبِيًّا لَعَلَّكُمْ تَعْقِلُونَ. Indeed, we have sent it down as an Arabic recitation so that you may understand. This is a very juicy ayah, but I want to first contrast two words have now been used for the Qur'an. The first is that we had kitab and now we have Qur'an. Qur'an literally means the recitation. That's how I translated it, right? So we have, and that's how the Prophet and the companions would have experienced the Qur'an itself, because it was a recitation. We have sent down the recitation, the Arabic recitation, so that you may become someone who understands. لَعَلَّكُمْ, so you might understand. I just think there's so much richness found here, because it's almost as if it being kitab is slightly different than it being Qur'an, but both are necessary. What I mean by that is, many of us will experience the Qur'an as a recitation, but maybe it won't be inscribed within us. But it was meant to do both. Recitation is almost as if it's taking part in our actions, and it also stays with us. And I find that there's like both of those introductions are needed before we get into the narrative of Yusuf alayhi salam, that this story is supposed to do a couple of things. It'll stay with you, and it'll change the way you literally behave, or you actively engage with things. Qur'an Arabiyan la'allakum ta'qilun. That we have sent this down. Like that appeal is found there. But what I really want to focus on is Arabiyan, Arabic. I know this is a conversation that many of us have frequently. I'm like, and a doubt that many Muslims have of like, why would Allah reveal a universal book that is literally supposed to be relevant until the day of judgment in a language? Shouldn't there be a Qur'an for every language that's invented, so that you may understand? And why was Arabic chosen? Doesn't it just seem unfair? And I want to address questions like that with this today, at least in the best way that I know how to. When we look at the Arabic language, first and foremost, it's actually unique in a couple of different ways. And it's not, I don't want to say it's the only language that has this quality. There are many languages that have this quality, but it's unique in the way that when we look historically, where it was developed in a desert. And the reason that's important is, one, almost every other word leads to water or a path to water. So it's already kind of funny, but like the lifeblood of what human beings need to survive. But the reason I say that is that leads to the development of a very pure tongue that does not take from many other spaces. And what I mean by that is, I think about languages that have been developed in empires. English is a good example of this. The words in English, they have like, but every other word, you don't know, it comes from another language. Why? Because it was generally developed as a trade language. You had a bunch of different nations interacting with each other, and each one was vying for resources. So as you're vying for resources, the language starts developing as a result of those, all of those human kind of wants and desires, right? Like I want to, and I think classic places where you can see that is if you ever go down like a shopping alley in like any part of the world where they're trying to sell you stuff. This happens in like Turkey or something. They'll come and they'll try to guess what ethnicity you are, and they'll be like, Hindi, Haisav Al. Like they'll mix a bunch of these languages together. Why? Because what are they trying to get at the end of the day? They're trying to get you to give them something, trying to get you to buy something. So the language itself starts becoming very, very purposeful. And what I mean by purposeful, like it has a very economic incentive to it. Versus, that's one of the cool things about Arabic, why it was considered such a beautiful tongue. It only had to do with human needs. And the reason is, how many natural resources exist in the desert?
Very few.
Like, and especially before oil was discovered, like, what are you going to do? Sell me water and food? Like, that's basically it. Like, what do you need to survive? And so what it leads to is, and it's also almost sensory deprivation. Why is it sensory deprivation? Because think about what is there to talk about in the desert. Like, when they saw a beautiful tree, they were just enthralled by it. They're like, there's a tree, because there's very few trees anywhere. What did they talk about? The stars, because that's all there is to look at. And what that leads to is a very rich language of feelings. Because what do you have to talk about? There's not much things to talk about. There's not many resources to talk about. How we feel, you have to develop a ton of vocab to describe it, because that's all we have. You only have the ability of speaking to each other and talking about your feelings. Leads to like a very pure language. And that's oftentimes why even at the time of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, any house that could afford it, like any noble house, they wouldn't want their kids to pick up the Arabic of the city. Why? Because the city Arabic was considered corrupt. Why? Why are people trying to teach you words in the city to sell you something? When you go off to the desert, that's when you learn pure Arabic. Why? Because you talk to each other for needs, for feelings, for beauty. A beautiful kind of form of communication develops. And that's one of the reasons why I really like Arabic. Arabic has this quality to it. It was in between two massive empires. Why did no one, and without getting into much of a history lesson, why did the Persian Empire and the Byzantine Empire not conquer Arabia? And the reason is, why would you want to rule over a desert? There's nothing there. It's more of a hassle to be in charge of than anything. And it's really interesting that that's going to be the place. That's the language Allah used or chose for the final message to come out with, is Qur'an and Arabian. We've revealed this as an Arabic recitation, and that's partly encouraging all of us that we should learn Arabic. But then the next natural question comes out: why any language to begin with? And what I mean by that is, why couldn't Allah just say just the meaning? And this gets into a theological question for Muslims of, we believe that the only Qur'an is the Qur'an in Arabic. So like if I read you a translation or handed you a book of English that was, and I claimed this was Qur'an, that wouldn't be Qur'an. Unless there's transliteration, we could make an argument then, because that's a recitation of it. But a translation isn't considered Qur'an. And the reason for that I see is because there should be an accessible way of maintaining the meaning from God. And what I mean by that is, if it was understood that it's just the meaning and not the words itself, there would be like 500 different copies of the Quran or translations of the Quran, and each one would mean something slightly different. What our tradition seems to do is say that anyone can have access to the Quran, but there are certain rules to follow. And what are those rules? You need to understand it in the language it was revealed. And that addresses two major extremes that exist, unfortunately, amongst religious traditions. There's one extreme amongst religious traditions that says that there's a scholarly class who is allowed to interpret the book. And that scholarly class, they have all of the tools and access to texts that normal people don't know about. So normal people, you have to just listen to these scholarly people. Why? Because these scholarly people have studied for years. They know a language that no one speaks anymore. So if they tell you God is telling you to do something, it must be right. And if you normal person ever tried to say, but I think so and so, do you speak this ancient random tongue? They're like, no. Well, you don't know what God wants. They're like, okay. And then there's the other side. The other side is everyone has access to everything. And what I mean by that is that it would be in terms of you can make your own translation whatever you want. You can say whatever it is to feel. And what happens then? Every other year, there's a new fad for what the religion is going to be. Every other year, someone's going to be like, I had an epiphany today, and I think it means this. You know that thing, that divine reality? No, it doesn't mean that anymore, because I have a group of people who think this. I have a group of people that think this. That's the other extreme, where it's a complete rejection of any source of conserved meaning and its individual meaning for everything. I think for me, the reason I really focus on this is that's, I think, the beauty of the democratization that the Quran leads to, that Islam kind of puts forward with the Quran, is the Quran will be accessible to everyone. The best surah of the Quran, the most highly ranked, is Surah Al-Fatiha, and that is a surah that my 4-year-old upstairs can read. If she found something in Fatiha or in Surah Fatiha, like that's the highest thing that anyone can recite, a 4-year-old can do it. Yet, its rules of interpretation are set. Why? well, it's going to be Arabic. There's not going to be too far you're going to be able to stray from an actual meaning. Why? Because this is the way the language is. This is the revealed text. So it has that ability of empowering people so that if a scholar randomly said something, like I believe this now, any Muslim can be like, yeah, but I can read the Qur'an and the Qur'an says this. So you can't actually pull the religion in too many different directions. That's one of the ideas, like why it's important, why the Qur'an and Arabian, that the Qur'an was revealed in Arabic. It really does capture that, and it's a necessity almost for there to be a flexible yet conserved religion or way of life. I've been talking for a while. Any reflections on what I said or this verse in general?
That's really interesting. Do you think like sometimes like it may cause like some like superiority complex or inferiority complex, people who are like Arabs or people who don't speak Arabs, they're thinking like, oh, it wasn't like revealed in their language and whatnot.
I'm really glad that you brought that up. And the reason I'm really glad you brought that up is yes, it does. And I think that's an inferiority complex that many of us who maybe weren't born speaking Arabic might have. But this is where I'll also say this ayah ends off as لَعَلَّكُمْ تَعْقِلُونَ, so that you may understand. That's one of the cool things about a language is I don't know how else to put this other than even if we look at it historically, most of the people who have made like seminal works of tafsir, in terms of like works of tafsir that almost everyone has to quote, or works of Islamic studies that everyone has to quote, they've been non-Arabs. And that's no bash against Arabs. But the reason I say that is they've been non-Arabs hereditary, like in terms of genetics. But they've been, in my opinion, more true Arabs than anything else. Why? Because they had to learn it. So they learned it in a more pure way than those that just inherited it, if that makes sense. So like when you look at Zamakhshari, when you look at Sahih Bukhari, for example, like you can't quote hadith that talk about Bukhari. Was Bukhari an Arab? No. It's from Samarkand, right? If we wanted like Russian, if we wanted to use today's kind of language from like that part of the world. We have who puts Arabic grammar together that we inherit from today, like Sibo, he's a German guy. Like, or a language isn't owned by just a race. It really is anyone who wants to work on it, they start taking it on. And Islamic studies almost seems to take that on. That even today, if you learn Arabic, just like watch Sesame Street, that's very different than learning Arabic to do what? To understand the Qur'an, understand Islamic studies. It's a different style of Arabic. And oftentimes the ones who learn it understand it at a deeper level than the ones who inherited it just because that's their mother tongue or something.
That's really awesome. Like it's like the same thing with a religion, like somebody just being born into a Muslim household versus somebody who kind of like, you know, had that awakening like in their late teen years or like early 20s or something like that. And they just have like a different connection with it, you know, versus like somebody who were just kind of like born with it and went with it their whole life.
Yeah, definitely.
Something that that Dr. I remember I heard this thing said by Dr. Sherman Jackson. He's this Islamic scholar. He said that there's this competition of Arabic that goes on in I think Saudi Arabia, and or at least it used to go on. And I think people from all different Muslim countries used to go and compete, including Arab countries. And the people who would win, like majority of the years, were Nigerians, yeah. Because their Arabic was just like so pure, because because it was spread to that place, and they weren't born with it necessarily.
Yeah. So that's why I oftentimes get asked the question or get told that like, man, I wish that I spoke Arabic or I grew up learning with this, like having Arabic with me. And then I now have exposure to enough people where I oftentimes will interact with people who are born in with Arabic and say like, man, I wish I had never been born knowing Arabic. Why? Because I took all this stuff for granted, without realizing I didn't actually know it. And what I mean by that is like, there's more to unlearn sometimes, because like half of competence ends up being incompetence, or worse than incompetence at times. So what I mean to say by all of this is I actually think this is supposed to be empowering. When we think of an Arabic Quran, it's every single human, if they make the effort, you can learn it. It can be there for you. And also the goal was not لَعَلَّكُمْ تَعْلَمُونَ, so that you may know more. It's تَعْقِلُونَ, so you may understand. And why I have to mention that is understanding is very different than knowing. Understanding, aqal. Someone can be given a ton of information, but they have no understanding. And there's someone else who has just a little bit of information, but they have a lot of understanding. And what I mean by that is, even look at this very surah. In this surah, we're going to have Prophet Yusuf, alayhi salam. He spends, I don't know, 5 or 6 years with his father. Spends maybe up until the age of 7 with him, right? And then he doesn't get any formal education about the deen ever at any time afterward. But what does Allah always say? His character was amazing. He was amongst the muhsineen, extremely righteous, extremely spiritual. How much information do you think a 7-year-old learned? It's not going to be a crazy amount. Yet it carries him for life. Because what did he have? He had aqal. لَعَلَّكُمْ تَعْقِلُونَ. There are some people who are going to learn one ayah. And that's why there's a narration of our Qur'an that says, learn one ayah and implement it and teach it. That'll be sufficient. That's all you need. Because there are some people with one ayah, they're going to be able to do more than someone who with the entire Qur'an is able to do. Because the goal was always لَعَلَّكُمْ تَعْقِلُونَ. You may have understanding. So like I find whenever the Qur'an, and it says it in a couple of different places, talks about Qur'an in Arabian, I find that to be the most empowering thing, because right afterward it says the goal isn't so that you may know more. Because if that was the goal, then it could happen that like people are like, oh man, it was harder for me to memorize. No. There are some people who will memorize one verse and they'll achieve much more success than someone who became a hafiz of the whole Quran. And that is the goal. لَعَلَّكُمْ تَعْقِلُونَ. Same thing here. Throughout this series, we're going to be talking about a lot of cool trivia, not trivia, but trivia is a weird way of saying it, but we're going to throw example after example. And the point of this isn't like, yeah, I got a bunch of things I can now quote at people. That's not it. What's the goal? لَعَلَّكُمْ تَعْقِلُونَ. So you can get the point of it. Get understanding. That's at the end of the day what we want. Some people are going to get it through what? One example. Some people's going to take 100 examples. That's fine. But you're trying to just get that one.
That's really deep. I feel like sometimes like in like Desi cultures or something, like they teach kids like all of these stories, like like info about like like all this information, but it's kind of just like for memorization purposes. It's like, oh, tell me like kind of, like what did I tell you yesterday? And you kind of just like repeat after me or something. You know what I'm saying? Like it just kind of like memorizing. But like as you grow older, like you kind of like attend these like sessions and MSA events, you kind of like see like the point behind them, like the lesson behind them, instead of just like kind of like memorizing this info and not relating to it.
Yeah, definitely. And it misses the point. And I think that comes down to there's a worldview that's promoted, and part of it is just practicality because it's kids. You want to set them up for as much levels of the success that you can, but there is an element of we think that success oftentimes comes from lots of things rather than qualitatively maybe getting someplace. So yeah, I think that there's a good point to bring up. Jazakallah khairan. The last ayah for today, I do want to be pretty strict with our time limit that we'll go for a little bit, about an hour a session per week. But the last ayah for today, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, نَحْنُ نَقُصُّ عَلَيْكَ أَحْسَنَ الْقَصَصِ بِمَا أَوْحَيْنَا إِلَيْكَ هَذَا الْقُرْآنَ وَإِن كُنْتَ مِنْ قَبْلِهِ لَمِنَ الْغَافِلِينَ. We relate to you the best of, I'm not going to use the term stories, and I'll tell you why. The best of following through our revelations of this recitation. Though before this, you were totally unaware. The reason I'm not going to translate it as that way. One is, if this actually was stories, qisas in Arabic is stories. Qisas, qa with a kasra, sa. Qasas is actually closer to like steps of templates. If I wanted to teach you how to build a home and I handed you a step-by-step process of how to build a home, that's qasas. It's a template. It won't like give you a whole thing. It'll give you a template. It'll give you, if you want to achieve the same thing, this is what you have to do at the end of it. That's more closely related to it. When Musa alayhi salam, again, we're going to keep quoting the story of Musa alayhi salam. When Musa alayhi salam's mother has put Musa alayhi salam in a basket and down a river, she says to her daughter, "Ussu," which is follow it. Follow it. And what does that mean? Does it mean swim in the water with it? No. Follow it from what you're capable of following it. That's the imagery I want you to have with qasas. We relate to you the best. We can say story, but it's not story for the sake of the details. It's story for the sake of being able to like benefit in the same way as what's being narrated. بما أوحينا إليك هذا القرآن. The best of stories through the revelation, through this recitation. And before it, you were totally unaware. A very easy translation to this is the Prophet ﷺ had no way of accessing the story of Yusuf ﷺ because the story of Joseph, in terms of in the Hebrew Bible, was considered the highest story, and like it was considered a story that like most people wouldn't have access to. It was extremely deep literary knowledge. So there's already kind of that. I actually used to ask my, I studied Jewish mysticism with a professor of mine when I was doing my master's. His name is Yahatzkel Landau. I actually asked as a group, me and a couple of the other students were like, what, can you tell us about the story of Joseph? He's like, that is considered the highest form of study. Like, wait, what do you mean? He's like, it's like you would have, that would be like third, fourth year in rabbinical studies. You're not allowed to just jump into that because there's so much kind of there. I was like, and has that always been the case? It's like, yeah, that would be the story that you taught Torah through. I was like, that's interesting. So the Prophet would have had no access to it. So that's the obvious thing. He had no access to kind of what the story was. But, and on a very practical level, that's how the Prophet ﷺ received Qur'an. What I mean by that is typically when you prepare a speech, you know what's going to come next if you want it to go eloquent. Like you don't just on the spot come up with something. But the Prophet ﷺ, as he's reciting Surah Yusuf, we're going to talk about all of the literary miracles of Surah Yusuf, its ring nature, its palindromic nature, the themes that go about it, the shirt that brings about clarity. There's so many cool literary elements all throughout. And the Prophet has no idea what's coming next. Yet it's still going to follow through. And the other idea of, we already talked about the Qur'an and Kitab. As soon as the Prophet has said it, companions are memorizing it and it's going out there. It's as if it's already been inscribed. There's no editing process anymore. We're going to narrate it to you while you have no idea of how to kind of get there. And the other part is Allah will give you details of this qasas that you never knew. And what that means is this is not the most detailed account of the story of Joseph that can be found. The biblical story of Joseph is actually quite a bit longer than the Quranic one. The Quran does have 100 some ayat about it, but the biblical story is way longer. But some of the details found in the Quran are not found within the biblical narrative. And what I mean by that is there's certain parts of the story which in the biblical level, it's got a lot more level details. How long did someone stay here? Did someone stay there? In the story of Yusuf alayhi salam in the Quran, you'll have, what did Yusuf alayhi salam do in the well? The dream that he asked his father, and how did his father respond? These are details that don't get captured in a historical account. What I mean by that is if you're narrating, like if you're trying to have a book of history, oftentimes what you'll have is born on this day, went to school this time to this time, learned this, made this decision at this time. You know what you don't have? Child woke up in the middle of the night, went to his father and tried interpreting a dream. And his father told him, hey, watch out for your brothers. It's a very interesting way of telling stories. And one of the reasons lots of we're telling you in the best of manners is this also comes down to when we think about specifically narratives are different than a complete capture of something. We're used to this because we watch things like movies, or at least I do. And we get really used to kind of like appreciating a good narrative when we hear it. A narrative, you don't capture the entire like day-to-day experience of someone. Every scene has a purpose. Like when we think of a really amazing director, I think of like Spielberg, for example. One of my favorite scenes in the movie Jurassic Park is when in the very beginning of the movie, they're on a helicopter. Dr. Alan Grant realizes that he has two of the same buckle, so he can't actually seatbelt himself in. So what does he do? He ties them in a knot in front of him. And someone might look at that and say, what a waste of a scene. But I'm like, that's a brilliant director. You know why? He's trying to establish that this character has really good critical thinking skills. So in a moment's notice, he's able to come up with a creative solution for a dangerous situation. I need to pay attention to him. A good director does that. Allah is the best of directors, of course. So this story, every detail, the ones that are omitted and the ones that are given have a purpose. And what is the purpose? They can all lead to what? Ta'qilun, for you to have understanding, for you to have something that's going to literally change your perspective in life. The story has all of those details. And that's really what we're going to try to focus on every single week. That's why we're going to split this up the way we are. We'll do maybe like 7 or 8 ayats per week, but we're going to try to get at those type of details. Why did Allah tell us this detail, and why did Allah leave out certain details? Because there's lots of story details in the story that are found in other other narrations of the story of Joseph. In the Bible, for example, we have that the man whose house Yusuf alayhi salam stays in, his name is Potiphar. We don't have that. We have in certain narrations that woman who tried to seduce him, her name is Zulayqa. We don't have that. How many years was he in prison? By biblical accounts, 13. By our accounts, we have no idea. Actually, in the Jewish things, that's 2 jubilees, so it's like approximately 14 years. So like we don't have those details, but because it's like, oh, those weren't important. What was important? What parts of it are important? When Yusuf enters into that house, the owner of that house told his spouse, make this residence a place of honor for him because we might adopt him as a son. That's a tiny conversation piece, but then immediately Allah jumps into right after that, and when he became a teenager. Wait, that's like 5 years worth. It doesn't matter. The details Allah captures are the most important ones. And why? Because what we're trying to capture is the essence of Yusuf alayhi salam. And also when you think about the essence of each of our stories, remember we said we're going to keep unpacking it. Sometimes 10 seconds of your life will dictate the next 20 years. It was the most meaningful 10 seconds. That's how it was for Yusuf alayhi salam as well. Allah chose certain details to keep and certain details to not keep. So that's also why Allah will give us parts of this story that we had never were aware of, or even motivations of Yusuf alayhi salam that people were never aware of, details that people were never aware of, and also the way of telling it or using it for its actual purpose that people were never aware of. All of that is kind of captured within قَبْلِهِ لِمَنْ لَمِنَ الْغَافِلِينَ, that people were completely unaware. Oh gosh, it's 7 o'clock. Any final concluding thoughts or reflections?
I have a question.
Yep.
So this might just be, so in the Arabic, does it say that, so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says we relate to you? Is it the same thing like saying is it the same thing as saying we are about to relate to you? Or is it completely present tense?
No, it's completely present tense. We are relating to you.
Okay, then I guess the follow-up question would be like, what I guess what does that mean?
That gets into a very, very interesting conversation, but I think what it means is we in whoever's reciting the surah right now, whoever's about to absorb the surah right now, that's also being told to us.
I see.
That's brilliant, actually. I didn't think about that. It's not just telling the Prophet that, it's telling the person who's reading it.
I have a question about qasas. So I'm just trying to like understand it in the right type of context. So when you said like steps or a template, would you say that like reading the story or the qasas, the steps would be for the person who's trying to gain wisdom. They're like steps for gaining wisdom.
Steps for, instead of using wisdom, I'm going to use the term that Allah uses, taqilun, to develop aqal, which is, in the best translations for them are either understanding or competency.
Mhm.
Yeah, does that make
All right,
sense?
that
'Cause
makes sense.
it
Yeah,
doesn't
totally.
say, it doesn't say tahkimun, even though it will say that in other places in the Quran. It uses aqal, and aqal is typically those two things. Aqal is like either common sense or like a deep understanding of something.
Jazakallah.
But yeah. Cool.
Actually, I have a question about like one of the very first ayah. I think it's the very first one. It's Alif Lam Ra, right?
Yep.
So whenever I see an ayah like that, it gets me thinking about how Rasulullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam is supposed to be like the unlettered prophet. So what's the significance of the unlettered prophet receiving these disjointed letters? Because I feel like there's something there, but I can't put my finger on it.
I had never put that together in English because like how well you did. Because in English we use the term unlettered, right? That's not actually something that in Arabic, ummi doesn't mean unlettered in that same way. Ummi means that how they speak hasn't been corrupted by society, right? Like corrupted by an education. So that's actually really interesting. In English, it seems to have this play on words like huruful muqatti'at, like huruf, and unlettered would be similar. In Arabic, they usually aren't. But I think there is something beautiful that says that someone who hasn't been kind of influenced by an education system, by a writing system, they would probably be able to show more humility towards things that no one understands. Like I can see that being kind of one of the reflections there.
So like how they have not been given like a mindset, but instead they were like blessed with like understanding by Allah, like the most like raw form of understanding, I guess.
Yeah. He's able to
Okay.
absorb it most because he doesn't have to unlearn anything.
Okay. That makes sense.
Does that make sense? Yeah.
Yeah, does that
Because Ummi, like the Prophet ﷺ, one of the names that he's given is Nabiul Ummi, the unlettered. We translate it in English as unlettered prophet, but it literally Ummi, like it sounds like which means mother, right? It's like as if they were freshly born from their mother. That's how pure that person is. Nabiul Ummi. Because everyone else has to maybe unlearn certain things. He doesn't. Any education he gets is from Allah completely.
Oh, so he's not like truly an unlettered prophet in the way that we might think. Okay, jazakallah khair.
Wait, inshallah, next week when we're together, we're going to start off with the first couple of ayat. I believe we're going to go up until ayah 11s for those who want to read beforehand. But some of the topics we'll be getting into is the idea of dreams, sibling rivalry. Again, this story has everything. And subhanAllah, I think it's a great opportunity as we go through this week by week for us to also think about, as the themes start coming in, how does that theme apply to me in my life? What's my relationship to dreams? What's my relationship to my family? How I talk to them? Harms that can take place between family members? What's my relationship to my siblings, whether you have them or you don't? Some of us have siblings that are related by blood. Others of us have siblings in our own minds. But it'll be kind of conversations around that are found, and also how you share information within a family and how communication takes place. We're going to be focusing a lot more on themes like that. And just as Allah puts this forward as qasas, these are stories that are meant to be templates for us to get to ta'qilun, get to some sort of understanding, or to increase our level of competence. Let's each week as we hit these themes, try to increase our competence or understanding of that particular theme that we went through. So with that, that's the intention I want all of us to come into as we continue this journey. I'm really looking forward to, inshallah, consuming just a few more ayat with you every single week. A challenge I will put out there, because it is it is a few months before Ramadan. I believe we're just like 2.5 months before Ramadan. One of the other reasons I've chosen to be slow with the ayat is I challenge you that try to memorize the ayat. It'll literally be like 7 ayat a week. Let's see if some of us can maybe memorize the entire surah if you haven't gotten to yet, each week with the ayat as we discuss them. One of the best ways to memorize Qur'an is to learn about it and really internalize the meaning. So as we're trying to internalize the meanings, try your best to try to memorize the ayat as it goes along. So with that, we'll end. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make us amongst those that inherit the story of Yusuf alayhi salam, that utilize the details that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives us and blesses us with to come to a position of understanding of aql, and to not be focused on the details that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not give us, so that we know what to focus on and we know what not to focus on whenever we consume anything. Ameen ya Rabbil Alameen. Jazakallah khairan. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Wa alaikum assalam.
وعليكم السلام ورحمة الله وبركاته.
وعليكم السلام.
Walaikum salam.
Wa alaikum assalam.
Really appreciate it all.